rejected the proposal of a legislative council, did so because of the fear that this would undermine Britain's commitment to Zionism. And there was widespread belief in the Houses of Parliament that Zionism was per se a good thing. The members of Parliament continued to believe the old narrative that European migration in the shape of Zionist migration would raise the living standards of the Palestinian Arabs, that the Zionists were civilising the backward Orient. And that was the spark that led to the uprising.
Arab leaders in Palestine now called for a general strike. It meant a total refusal to pay taxes and a countrywide strike of all Arab workers and businesses. The Arab leadership quickly organised themselves to coordinate further political demonstrations and strikes. They formed the Arab Higher Committee. Its role, to make demands of the British government during the unrest. The head of this new organisation was the Grand Mufti himself. The Grand Mufti declared that the strike would continue until all Jewish immigration into Palestine was stopped. During the summer of 1936, the strikes brought the region to a standstill. Shops and businesses were forced to close throughout Palestine. It immediately caused widespread unrest. As violence broke out, the country's infrastructure was smashed. The transport network was sabotaged. British troops were sent in to quell the rising violence. They targeted Arab gangs who were attacking Jewish communities indiscriminately. It was the start of a 3-year-long bloodbath that became known as the Arab Revolt. During that first summer, thousands of acres of Jewish farmland were destroyed. The British tried in vain to keep the peace. But by October of 1936, with the revolt already 6 months old, an estimated 1,300 people had been killed. The British set up and dispatched a committee to the region, known as the Peel Commission. Its task was to investigate the reasons for the clashes and to come up with solutions. But their recommendations would only make things worse for the Palestinians.
The Peel Commission came to conclusion, including a recommendation which were very clearly tailored according to the wishes of the Zionist movement, that is the partition of Palestine. That was the first clear pronouncement from a British source, official source, on the issue of partition. And of course that was vehemently rejected by the Palestinians, including the Mufti.
The new map gave the Jews their own land in the north, with the British retaining the area around Jerusalem. Fearing that their country was about to be carved up, violence again flared in the region. In 1937, el-Husseini was deposed as president of the Supreme Muslim Council by the British authorities, and the Arab Higher Committee was declared illegal.
Unrest in Palestine. Suspecting that the Higher Committee had incited Arab leaders to start a holy war against the British government, police swooped on the secret headquarters of assassins and rebels. Many arrests were made. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, head of the Muslim Supreme Council, was deprived of office. The frontiers are guarded with special vigilance. All roads leading to Jerusalem patrolled. The British government is determined to stamp out terrorism.
Warrants for the arrest of the leaders of the committee were issued, but the Grand Mufti escaped to the Haram, the holy area of the city, where he was untouchable by the British. After 3 months in hiding, he fled the country and began a tortuous journey that would end at the very heart of the Nazi regime.
He's staying in Syria, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Foremost in the Palestine-Arab trouble, he eluded the British and escaped from the Mosque of Omar.
Now in exile in Syria, he continued to direct the war against the British. But British troop numbers were too small to crush the revolt. Strikes, sabotage, assassinations, and the guerrilla warfare went on without let-up. The British military presence was small in comparison to the Palestinian Arab forces. They were being overrun. But then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain found a new way of freeing up extra troops. He signed a deal with Hitler, giving him part of Czechoslovakia. Allegedly, this made Europe safe from the threat of war. With more than 20,000 troops, 3 RAF squadrons and 4,000 police, the British now began to squeeze the life out of the Arab revolt. Villagers accused of sheltering Arab rebels had their houses blown up. Those Arabs suspected of taking part in the fighting were killed or beaten. Thousands of men were rounded up and imprisoned in detention camps without trial. At least 112 Arabs were hanged for taking part in the rebellion. According to official figures, by the spring of 1939, when the revolt effectively ended, the British had killed more than 2,000 Arabs.
The British crushed the Arab uprising, which was the most significant challenge to British imperial authority in the 1930s, and a testament to the Palestinian national movement at that time. But because of the extent of British military suppression of that revolt and the brutality of that suppression against the Palestinian Arab people, you end up with a floundering Palestinian Arab movement after the revolt and going into the Second World War. And the movements of el-Husseini after the revolt are really a testament to that floundering of the Palestinian Arab national movement that's completely lost after the revolt and after it being crushed by the British.
But then in May 1939, the British government did an amazing U-turn. With Europe now back on the verge of war, they realized that they simply did not have enough men and machines to defend the Suez Canal and the precious oil fields of Iraq and Persia, as well as fighting Arab rebels in Palestine. Arab public opinion in the Middle East needed to be appeased. So they produced a paper calling for strict limits on Jewish immigration and the creation of an independent Palestine by 1949. Here was an offer that seemed to give al-Husseini and his freedom fighters everything they'd asked for.
The 1939 White Paper was seen by many Palestinian nationalists, including some radical nationalists, as a real achievement of the fight that has been waged by the Palestinians ever since the start of the revolt, the Great Revolt in 1936.
It was a sharp curtailment of Jewish immigration that was going to be limited to 75,000 over the following 5 years. And also a commitment that in 10 years' time there would be an independent Palestinian state.
They really saw in the White Paper the outcome of these years of struggle and the very high cost that they had to pay for that in lives and in repression and all that.
This was a real chance for the Mufti to get what he wanted. Such was his hatred of the British that he dismissed their efforts to attempt to win him over. He rejected the White Paper's recommendations, and he went much further. He called for an end to the British mandate in Palestine. He wanted the British out and the creation of a single Arab state. The forces that propel him to collaborate with the Nazis were now inevitable.
He had his own selfish personal ambitions above any considerations of the real interest of his people and of the movement. I'm saying that because, again, many nationalist leaders of the Palestinians considered that the white paper should have been accepted, and at the time were in favor of expressing approval of the white paper and seeing in the white paper a victory of the movement.
Now the Grand Mufti was effectively at war with the British, and he desperately needed allies. He gave a clear indication of who they might be. Al-Husseini was quoted as saying, "What do we care who backs us, or who we align ourselves with, as long as it helps us to attain our goals? We have a common enemy, the British and the Jews." As the war began in Europe, al-Husseini's deteriorating relationship with the Syrian authorities forced him to move on from his base in Damascus. This time, he made for the Kingdom of Iraq. In Baghdad, he continued his political agitating, and in 1941 was involved in an anti-British revolt. From his base in Iraq, he issued a fatwa for a holy war against Britain. But just days later, British troops invaded Iraq, and al-Husseini was forced to move on yet again. This time, he made for fascist Italy, where he met with the country's dictator, Benito Mussolini. Whilst in Italy, the Grand Mufti prepared a declaration confirming his support for the Axis powers. He was officially declaring his allegiance to the Nazis and their supporters. Within days, it had been sent to the German embassy in Rome. And on the 6th of November 1941, the Grand Mufti entered Berlin for the first time to meet directly with German officials.
When the Mufti arrived in 1941 in Berlin, he was, of course, greeted by many Nazi officials, especially those who were in touch already with him and in charge of operations in the Middle East, the political and strategic operations of Nazi Germany in the Middle East. But he, of course, requested to meet the Führer. He believed that his own stature meant that he had to meet in person the chief of the Nazis. The Hitler was not very much enthused about this idea of meeting a person like that.
Although reluctant to meet in person with the Grand Mufti, Hitler was told by his advisors that it might be useful in convincing him to help Germany win over the Arab population of the Middle East. So on November the 28th, 1941, the Grand Mufti was ushered into a private room in Hitler's chancellery. Surrounded by Nazi dignitaries, he finally met the Führer. It wasn't a long meeting, but al-Husseini appeared to get what he so desperately wanted.
Hitler was saying, give me some time, let us develop our military strategy, and when we'll be in the military position of dominating this part of the world, we will fulfill your desires of independence. But until then, I have political considerations, so you have to, accept my pledge, and that's it. And this was the only meeting Hitler ever gave the Mufti.
The deal was pretty clear. While the Nazis stopped short of actually recognizing an independent Palestine, Hitler was planning to deal with the Jews who'd settled in the country. And so began the